All right, welcome to the deep dive, everyone. You know, finding the right patients for these clinical trials, man, it's a huge problem. It's like a massive roadblock in the way of, medical progress. Just think about this for a second. The requirements to even be considered for a trial, they've skyrocketed, up 58% in the last 2 decades. It's wild.
Yeah, and you got to think about those doctors and researchers, those folks who are really in the trenches trying to navigate this crazy complex maze of rules. I mean, they're spending so much time just going through patient records manually, trying to make sense of it all.
Oh, absolutely. And the stats just back that up, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the average time spent reviewing a single patient's file, it's a whopping 50 minutes. And the kicker, 88% of the time, that patient ends up not even qualifying for the trial. It's a massive time sink, and it really messes with drug development timelines. Think of it, something like 30% of phase 3 trials, they get shut down simply because they can't find enough participants. It's a real bummer.
Yeah, and that's a problem for all of us, right? I mean, that means those new treatments, the ones that could be saving lives, they're stuck in limbo. They're not reaching the people who need them most. It's a real setback.
Totally. But there's a bit of a silver lining here. One of our awesome listeners sent us this really interesting research paper. It's called Real-World Validation of a Multimodal LLM-Powered Pipeline for High-Accuracy Clinical Trial Patient Matching Leveraging EHR Data. It's by Callies and their team.
And this paper, it's all about this really cool new way of using AI. It's like turbocharging the process of matching patients to the right clinical trials, making it way faster and a lot more accurate.
That's what we're going to be diving into today. We really want to break it down for you. Like, how does this thing actually work? What makes it different from those older systems that didn't quite hit the mark? And of course, what kind of results are they seeing in the real world? And most importantly, what does this mean for the future of clinical trials? Can we get these life-saving treatments to patients faster? That's the big question here.
Exactly. Getting those treatments out there quicker, that's the goal.
So let's take a step back for a second, before we get into all the nitty-gritty of this new tech. Why haven't previous AI approaches really solved this problem? What were they tripping over?
Well, a big issue was that a lot of those earlier AI models, they weren't really built for deep thinking, They kind of struggled with the logic behind those clinical trial eligibility rules, which can be super specific and, sometimes pretty subtle. And a lot of these older systems, they were really focused on processing text, words on a page, that kind of thing.
And that brings up this whole other issue, right? The visual stuff, the images and charts that are all over medical records. That's a big deal, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's not just about the words. Think about it. You open up a patient's file, and it's not just pages and pages of type notes. You got tables with lab results. You got graphs tracking vital signs. You even have those scribbled handwritten notes, the kind that only a pharmacist can decipher. And the researchers, they found that a crazy 46% of medical record pages have this kind of information, stuff that's not just plain text.
46%. That's like almost half of everything.
Yeah.
So if your AI can only read plain text, it's basically missing out on a ton of info. Or you have to try and convert all those visuals into text somehow, which can be a real mess, right? Error city.
Totally. And the thing is, even with things like OCR, optical character recognition, it can still be slow, it can be expensive, and yeah, you're going to get errors. And as the researchers point out, being able to look at an image directly, to grab the info you need, it's just faster and often way more accurate.
Right. It's like trying to describe a crazy detailed picture to someone over the phone, You're going to miss some of the important stuff no matter how hard you try.
Right.
And then there's this other big headache, right? The way electronic health records are set up. It's all over the place.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. You'd think that every hospital and research center would be using the same systems, all neat and tidy. But in reality, it's a total mess, especially here in the US. The EHR market is super fragmented. Only a tiny fraction of Medicare patients, something like 4.5%, have all their records with one single company. And get this, almost 20% have their records spread across 8 or more different systems.
8. Wow. So even if you've got this amazing AI, getting it to talk to all these different EHR systems, it's a nightmare. Like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, over and over again.
Exactly. And that lack of a standard way to access data from these different EHR systems, it's been a huge roadblock. A lot of those earlier AI solutions, they just couldn't be used widely because of this issue.
Okay, so those were the challenges, the hurdles, the roadblocks, all the stuff that was holding back these earlier AI systems. Now let's get to the fun stuff, this new pipeline. What's the big idea here? What makes this thing tick?
So the core idea is to build an AI system that doesn't need to be plugged into each and every EHR system individually. Instead, it goes straight to the source, It works directly with the raw, unprocessed documents that come from those systems, so you can bypass all those complicated connections. And they've got 3 main innovations that make this whole thing possible.
3. All right, lay it on me. What's the first one?
Vision language models, or VLMs, that's the first biggie. These are like the next generation of AI models. They can understand both visual and textual info at the same time. So instead of trying to convert those medical record images into text, which is a hassle, the VLM can just look at them directly. It can see those tables, the charts, even those funky handwritten notes.
That's like next level stuff, right? It's actually seeing the information, no more middleman.
Exactly. And because of that, you avoid losing information, which was a big problem with OCR. And the system gets to use way more data, which is always a good thing. All right, innovation number 2, visual retrieval.
Visual retrieval, huh? That sounds kind of cool. What's that all about?
Think of it like a super-powered search engine, but just for medical records. But instead of just looking for keywords, it can actually search for visually similar stuff. They use these things called multimodal embeddings. It's like creating a special digital fingerprint for each page that captures both the visual layout and the text. They talk about using Voyage AI's model in the paper, and apparently it's really good at finding similar documents visually, so you can quickly zero in on that relevant visual information tucked away in a patient's files.
So say a trial needs a specific type of graph, like for lab results.
Yeah.
The system can scan through the patient's history and pick out those similar-looking graphs, right? That's going to be way more efficient. All right, what about that third innovation? You got me on the edge of my seat here.
All right, number 3, the reasoning model. Now, this is where they're using those cutting-edge LLMs, the large language models, but this one's been specifically trained to tackle complex logic and calculations. And that's important because a lot of those older models, the ones that were really good at, like, chat and stuff, they would sometimes get tripped up by things like calculating dates or making sense of, like, ranges of lab values.
Yeah, the paper talks about that. I mean, it seems so basic, but those models would sometimes struggle with that stuff.
Right. But these newer reasoning models, like the OpenAI O1 model they used in this study, they're way better at dealing with those tricky eligibility criteria, the ones that involve all those time limits and multiple conditions. It's not just about understanding the words anymore. These models are like actually thinking things through, just like a human expert would.
Gotcha. So we've got the visual understanding, we've got the visual searching, and now we've got the brains to make sense of all those complicated rules. But how do all these pieces actually fit together? Can you give us like the simplified version of how this system works?
Sure, no problem. The pipeline has 3 main stages, right? First, it processes all the trial information, then it tackles the patient's records, and then finally it tries to match them up. Let's start with how it handles that trial info.
Sounds good. What goes on in that first stage?
Okay, so it takes those eligibility criteria for the clinical trial, which usually comes in the form of free text from websites like clinicaltrials.gov, and it breaks it all down. First, it splits those overall criteria into individual requirements so each one can be checked separately. That makes sense, right?
That makes sense.
Then it cooks up this thing called a relevance criterion. Think of it as like a really broad filter focusing on the main disease or condition the trial's all about. This lets them quickly weed out patients who are clearly not a good fit. Saves a ton of time.
So like, if it's a heart trial, you wouldn't waste time looking at someone with like a skin condition, right?
Yeah.
That's a smart move.
Right on. And the last thing it does in this stage is to create what they call retrieval guidelines. These are basically instructions written up by an LLM that tell the system where to look in a patient's file. It's like saying, hey, if you're checking for this particular medication, go look at the patient's medication list or those progress notes. It's all about making the search smarter,
So it's not just blindly searching through everything. It's got a roadmap like, hey, check over here, look over there.
Precisely. All right, now let's move on to how it deals with a patient's records once they're uploaded.
Okay, so the records come in probably as PDFs, right?
Whoa.
What happens next?
First thing, it splits that PDF into separate images, basically one for each page. Then, and this is super important, especially for all you listeners out there, it anonymizes those documents. They use methods that meet those IPA safe harbor guidelines, the rules for keeping health info private. And they use tools like Google Cloud DLP, data loss prevention, to scrub out any details that could identify the patient. So rest assured, folks, your privacy is protected.
That's good to hear. Privacy is a big deal when we're talking about this kind of stuff. So what happens after they made everything anonymous?
Okay, so then they run those anonymized images through that fancy multimodal embedding model we talked about, the one from Voyage AI. Remember those visual fingerprints we were talking about? Well, this is where they create them, those unique representations of each page, capturing both the visual stuff and the text. And then they store all those embeddings in a special database, a vector database, which is designed for super fast searching based on, the meaning and visual similarities of all that data.
So we've got the trials all organized with their criteria and their search guidelines. We've got the patient records all prepped and ready to go, anonymized and all that. Now, for the main event, the matchmaking, right? How does the system actually figure out if a patient's a good fit for a particular trial?
It's a 2-step process. First, there's that quick relevance check we talked about earlier. Remember that broad relevance criterion they created for each trial? Well, they use that to do a quick scan in the database and find the most relevant page in the patient's file. Then, they run that page through a simpler AI model, GPT-4o in this case, just to see if the patient even meets that basic requirement.
It's like a quick first glance to see if it's even worth digging deeper, right?
Right, exactly. And if the patient passes that initial screening, then the real evaluation begins. They call it the assessment stage. For each specific eligibility criterion, the system uses those retrieval guidelines to zero in on the most relevant parts of the patient's records. Then they feed those snippets to the big gun, the multimodal reasoning model, that OpenAI O1, and that's where it makes the call. Does the patient meet the criterion? Does the patient not meet the criterion? Or is there just not enough info in the records to say for sure?
Okay, so it's like a multi-step process, starting broad and then getting more and more specific with the help of AI along the way. Now, the million-dollar question, how well does this whole thing actually work? The paper shows results from both a public data set and, more importantly, from actual clinical practice. Let's start with that public data set. What did they use?
They used the N2C2 2018 dataset, which is kind of like a gold standard for testing this kind of patient matching stuff. It's mainly focused on diabetes patients. And even though this dataset is mostly text, the researchers, they got kind of clever. They turned all that text into low-resolution images just to put their visual processing skills to the test,
Oh, it's interesting. So they intentionally made it harder for their system just to see how it would handle it. What happened? What were the results?
Well, on that N2C2 dataset, their method hit a new record, a new state-of-the-art accuracy for individual criterion assessment. They got 93%. That's a huge jump from what previous methods were able to achieve.
93%. And that's with data they intentionally messed with. That's a pretty good sign. But you're right, the real test is how this thing performs out in the real world with real patients and all those messy medical records. What about that real-world testing? What do they do?
Okay, so for this, they did a beta test of their tool at 30 different medical sites. They had 485 actual patients being considered for 36 different clinical trials with a total of 650 individual eligibility criteria. So we're talking about a much wider range of data here, which is a better reflection of what it's actually like out there in the field.
Yeah, that sounds like a much tougher test. So how did it do?
The overall accuracy on those individual criteria in the real world, it was 87%. A little lower than what they got on that benchmark dataset, but still a very solid number, especially considering how much more complex those real-world records are.
87% is still pretty darn good. Any ideas why it dipped a little bit compared to that more controlled setting?
Yeah, they had some thoughts on that. One idea is that it's just really hard to perfectly copy how a human makes decisions, especially when those medical records are missing info, which happens a lot. They found that over 80% of the times when the AI and the human reviewers disagreed, it was because the AI had said, nope, not eligible. And when they looked at the feedback from the users, it seemed like those clinical research coordinators, those CRCs, they're more likely to be cautious. They might not rule out a patient right away if the records are a bit unclear. They might dig a little deeper, ask some questions.
Right, so a human might follow up with the patient or try to track down some missing info, whereas the AI might just see that missing piece and say, well, not enough evidence, got to say no.
That's the idea. But here's the interesting part. There's a positive side to those differences. When the info was clear-cut and the AI said yes or no based on those inclusion or exclusion criteria, it was right 100% of the time, at least with their real-world data.
That's actually really reassuring. It means that when the evidence is there, the AI's judgment is spot on. Now, beyond accuracy, the whole point of this technology is to save time, right?
Yeah.
So what did they find in terms of, actual time savings?
Oh, the time savings were huge. The users were able to check a patient's eligibility for a trial in under 9 minutes on average using this pipeline. That's a whopping 80% faster than doing it the old-fashioned way, manually going through all those charts.
80%. That's a game changer. I mean, that frees up so much time to those research staff. They can focus on other important things like, actually running the trial. And what about the AI itself? How long did it take to do its thing, to do all those calculations and analysis?
Well, on average, it took about 24.8 seconds to assess a single eligibility criterion, and that's using all the notes in a patient's file. But if they just focus on the top 3 most relevant notes, the ones picked out by those retrieval guidelines, it went even faster, down to 19 seconds. And the cost was pretty low too, around 15 cents per criterion, which could drop to 9 cents with that top 3 strategy.
So it's not just saving time for the humans, it's also pretty efficient on its own. I like it. And the paper mentioned something about user feedback, right? Like, the humans can actually tell the system if it's right or wrong. What's that all about?
Oh, that's a key part of the whole thing. So after the AI gives its assessment for each criterion, the humans can either say, yep, you got it right, or nope, you messed up. They can also give their overall verdict on the patient's eligibility for the whole trial, and all that feedback, it gets collected and used to figure out how accurate the AI is and where it needs to improve. They even show a little example in the paper, like a screenshot of how the AI presents its reasoning, including the specific quotes it pulled from the records and stuff, and then there's a little button for the human to give their feedback. It's pretty neat.
It's like they're training the AI as they go along, right? Learning from the expert.
Exactly, always learning. Now, the researchers also did some deeper dives into their results, trying to figure out what was working well and what could be improved. What did they find? Well, one thing they looked at was the impact of that visual retrieval system and those retrieval guidelines. They found that when the system looked at more images from a patient's file, it was better at finding all the relevant info. They call that recall. But here's the interesting part. Even when it looked at fewer images, it was still pretty good at avoiding irrelevant stuff, which they call precision. So it's finding the sweet spot.
Yeah, that's a good balance to strike. You want to make sure you're not missing anything important, but you also don't want to drown in a sea of useless info. What about those retrieval guidelines? Did they work as well as they thought?
That's where things get a little surprising. The guidelines did seem to help the system find more of the relevant info, but when they compared it to just using a certain number of images, the benefit wasn't as clear. And sometimes those guidelines actually hurt the precision a little bit. So they think there's still room for improvement there, maybe by making those guidelines more dynamic. Instead of just one set of rules, maybe they need to be a bit more adaptable based on the specific situation.
So the idea of guiding the AI's search is good, but the execution needs a little more work, right? Always room for improvement. What else did they analyze?
They also broke down the results by the type of eligibility criteria. Were there any criteria that tripped up the AI more than others? So they looked at things like those criteria related to other health conditions that the patient might have, their demographics, the specifics of their main disease, their lab results, all that stuff. And what they found was that the accuracy was pretty consistent across all those different categories, which is good news. It means the system is pretty versatile. It's not just good at one specific type of criterion.
That makes sense. You wouldn't want an AI that's awesome at reading lab results, but then totally bombs when it comes to understanding a patient's medical history.
Yeah.
That would be a problem. But hey, no system is perfect, right? Every system's got its quirks. works. What limitations did they point out in their study? What were they still grappling with?
One of the big ones was figuring out when the AI's assessment is a clear yes or no versus a maybe. It goes back to that whole thing about human reviewers being more cautious when the records are a bit fuzzy. Deciding when there's enough evidence to definitively say yes or no, that's a tricky judgment call, even for humans. And getting the AI to make those calls consistently, well, that's still a work in progress.
Yeah, it's all about nuance, right? And it seems like humans are wired to err on the side of caution when things are unclear. They want more information before making a big decision.
Absolutely. And the second limitation they highlighted was figuring out how to combine all those individual assessments into a single recommendation for the whole trial. Like, even if a patient meets most of the criteria, if they miss one really important one, they're out, right? So it's not just about adding up the number of yeses. You need a smarter way to figure out the final verdict.
Right, it's like a puzzle, figuring out how all those pieces fit together.
Yeah.
So this new pipeline is super promising, but there's definitely still work to be done. All right, let's wrap this up. For our listeners out there, what's the big takeaway from all this?
I think the main takeaway is this. This new AI system could be a game changer for finding the right patients for clinical trials, making the whole process way faster and more accurate. By being able to see those visual elements in medical records and by using those advanced reasoning skills, it's really overcoming a lot of the limitations of those older AI systems.
And one thing that really blew my mind was that stat about 46% of medical records having all that visual stuff. This new approach, it tackles that head on, which could be a huge win for patients in the long run.
For sure. For research centers and drug companies, this could mean faster enrollment, lower costs, and ultimately getting those new treatments out there quicker. And for people who are hoping to participate in trials, it could mean faster access to those cutting-edge treatments. And because this system doesn't need all those complicated connections to different hospital systems, it could be adopted much more widely, which is huge.
Yeah, it's like breaking down those barriers, making things more accessible, which is always a good thing. Okay, before we go, I want to leave you with a little something to ponder. As AI becomes more and more common in clinical research, what's going to happen to those human experts, those clinical research coordinators? Could their jobs change? Maybe instead of spending all that time poring over records, they could focus on those trickier cases, the ones where the AI isn't sure. Or maybe spend more time interacting with potential participants, building relationships. What new skills might they need as all this technology evolves?
Those are great questions. Definitely something to think about as this field continues to grow.
Absolutely. And hey, if you're curious about the technical side of things, the researchers have actually put their code up on GitHub. We'll make sure to drop a link in the show notes so you can check it out if you're interested.
And as always, a huge thank you to all our listeners, especially the one who sent us this paper. You guys are the reason we do this, Your curiosity keeps us going.
That's right. Keep those questions coming, folks. Until next time, stay curious.